Alright guys, and now I want to do a quick lesson on the square of the pawn and something called the Reti position or the Reti study, which is based on the concept of the square of the pawn. So right now white is going up and black is going down. Both sides have a pawn each, but it seems that white's pawn is first, but black's pawn is actually more scary for white's king than the white pawn for the black king, because as we can see here, the black king is in the square of the white pawn. And let's make the square together. I've done it in one of the earlier lectures, but let's try it again. So you always go towards the queening square. So let's say I'm the pawn and I'm calculating if the king can catch up to me or not. So I will go towards the queening square. So the pawn, the queening square, and that took me 2 moves, right, to get to c8. So now I will go 2 squares sideways towards the king and I will land on a6, and then I will go 2 squares diagonally. So the square will actually be the square of the pawn, the promotion square, the diagonal towards the side of the king. So if the king is on the left, I will go towards the left. If the king was on the right, then I will go towards the right. In this case, this is the triangle, and to finish the square, I just need to take a line to the side, so just a line horizontally to the left, and I get to the king, and that's the square of the pawn. If the king is in the square, he can catch the pawn no matter how fast it tries to run. If the king was outside the square, let's say it was on a5 instead of a6, and it was white to move, then white is faster and black cannot catch up to the pawn. If it was black to move, black just has enough time to catch up to the pawn and get into the square. If the king is in the square, then the pawn is in big trouble because it doesn't have enough time to run and promote. The black king will eat it first. If you look at the square of this pawn, you can say, so where is the square? So let's do it from h5. The first corner is the h5 square, is the pawn itself. Then we go to the promotion square. We take 1, 2, 3, 4 steps down to h1. So it's 4 squares. Then we go 4 squares diagonally to the side of the king. In this case, there is only one side. We can only go left. So it must be to d1, 4 squares. And then we take 4 squares to the only side we can, which is now left. If this king was on this side, on the right, then I would go towards the right, but clearly that's not possible here. So the square is h5, h1, d1, and d5. Those are the two, I should say, 4 corners we can use here. Okay, and now we know the square of each pawn. It becomes apparent that this king can catch the white pawn, but the white king cannot, unless it cheats a little. And that's where the red tie position comes to play. So what's the red tie position? There was a guy named Richard Reti. He lived, or Reti, he lived a long time ago in the beginning of the 20th century. And he was playing around with pawn end games. And he thought, what if we combine the squares of both pawns? And if we combine the threat of promotion with catching up to the other pawn square, let's see where that will take us. So the white king seems too far away, but he can cheat. So he starts going towards both pawns at once. He doesn't go here because this would end very tragically for the white king. He can chase for a long time, but in the end, it's just a matter of time before black gets a queen, and then white will lose. Instead of that, the black king or I should say the white king gets very sneaky. He starts going towards his own pawn. And the point is that after the black pawn tries to go to h4 and promote, then we go to f6, and we are going towards our pawn and their pawn at the same time. If he's really stubborn and can only push the pawn and can only think about that and doesn't realize the point of white's plan, white actually has this move. And now it turns out that it doesn't matter that the black king is in the square, because the white king can support the pawn until it reaches the end. So for example, black goes here, white will play c7. If black gets a queen, white gets a queen with check, and that's a draw. If black tries to be stubborn and catch up our pawn, then we will be stubborn as well, and our king is just in time to get a queen for us as well, and that's another draw with a queen each. So it seems that black has no way to win. So let's try a different way that black can try to win. So we put everything back, and this is the study. So after the move king to g7, black can try to raise the pawn once, but after we go to f6, black will try to stop our pawn with his own king, so he will try to eat it up. But that's where this move comes in. So king e5, and we are heading towards both pawns at the same time, towards both squares. And in this way we cheat because we force him to take the pawn. If he doesn't take the pawn, we will queen our pawn. So he will go to h2, we'll go to c7. He promotes, we promote at the same time. And if he takes the pawn, then voila, suddenly we are in the square of the pawn. We should even play king to f4 as to eat the pawn even faster. And the black king is helpless because now we're in the square and the black king is too far away and we're gonna eat the black pawn. So even though it looked like there was no way we could ever catch up to the black pawn, we managed because we kind of cheated using r square as a threat to steal two moves in order to get into the square of this black pawn, after which it's a drawn position. One last thing I'll mention about the square of the pawn. When you guys are calculating the squares of pawns on the second or the seventh, how do we do it? Because the pawn can actually go twice, and that's where it becomes a bit tricky. The way I do it, I just pretend that the pawn is on a3 for the purpose of this rule of the square. Just pretend that the pawn is not on a2, it's on the third rank, and it's not on h7, it's actually on h6. And I draw the square from there. So if the king, black king, is in the square of this pawn, then he will be in the square of the a2 pawn. And if the white king is in the square of the h6 pawn, then he will be in the square of the h7 pawn. That's an easy way to imagine the square of that pawn. Otherwise, a lot of people do try to calculate. They say pawn goes here, I go here, pawn goes there, I go here, and they keep calculating until they get to the end. But that's such a complicated version, and people often get confused, especially when there are pawns on both sides. That's why the rule of the square makes it easier for us to figure out if the king is in time or to catch the pawn or not.